Good morning or good afternoon, wherever you may be. I'm Dan Samico, one of the co-heads of the Akin Gump Global Project Finance Practice, and thank you for joining us this morning or this afternoon, wherever you are. On May 1st, 2020, President Trump signed an executive order on securing the United States bulk power system. The order was aimed at regulating the technology that's incorporated into the U.S. electrical transmission system so as to secure it against threats from foreign adversaries. The order is facially broad in its reach, covering any acquisition, importation, transfer, or installation of any bulk power system electric equipment. The order has caused a fair amount of discomfort and uncertainty for players in the electric energy space. But what does it mean? What does it apply to? Will it affect development and financing of new projects? Will it impact existing infrastructure? We've convened a panel of Akin Gump policy and industry experts to help answer some of the questions, allay some of the uncertainty, and provide some potential avenues for action that might be beneficial to concerned stakeholders. With us are Clete Willems and Jamie Tucker from Akin Gump's policy group, Shiva Aminian from Akin Gump's international trade team, and Chip Cannon, the head of Akin Gump's energy markets practice. If our panelists wouldn't mind taking a brief moment to introduce themselves in more detail, now would be a good time to do that.
Hi, this is Clete Willems.
Good.
I'm a partner in Akin Gump's PLP practice, where I work on a whole range of issues related to international trade and international economics. Prior to joining Akin, I was at the White House from 2017 to 2019 as part of the National Economic Council and the National Security Council.
Jamie, do you want to give people a little profile of your practice?
Good morning. My name is Jamie Tucker. I have been with Akin for a little over 21 years, having worked for Republican members of the House and the U.S. Senate. In my private practice, I focus on energy, power, and environmental issues for a range of clients.
Shiva, would you like to give people a little of your profile?
Hi, my name is Shiva Aminian. I'm a partner in the International Trade Group. It's good to be here with you today. My practice focuses on working with companies to understand the practical implications of the government's actions and what it actually means for their business.
Thanks, Shiva. And Chip, maybe you can give folks a bit of your background.
Sure. Hi, everyone. As Dan mentioned, I'm the head of the firm's energy regulation, markets, and enforcement practice. That means I primarily appear before FERC and do a lot of work with the wholesale power markets, participate in DOE programs, as well as State Public Utility Commission proceedings.
Well, thank you, panelists. Appreciate you being with us today and providing your insights and perspectives. Let's jump right in with Clete. Maybe, Clete, you can give us some background on U.S.-China relations and the purpose of the executive order to set the table for the balance of our discussion.
Thanks, Dan. Appreciate the intro. I'd like to talk today about the origins of the bulk power system executive order and how it fits into the broader context with respect to China. In many respects, I would date the origins of this policy back to 2017 with the adoption of President Trump's national security strategy and the related administration strategy on countering China's economic aggression. These strategies clearly articulated for the first time that the United States should view China as a strategic competitor, and they directed the entire U.S. government to consider policies to counter the economic and national security threat that's posed by China. At around the same time, the Director of National Intelligence's worldwide threat assessments began talking more and more regularly about the danger that adversaries and strategic competitors pose to U.S. critical infrastructure. Indeed, the 2019 Worldwide Threat Assessment says the following. It says China presents a persistent cyber espionage threat and a growing attack threat to our core military and critical infrastructure systems. China has the ability to launch cyber attacks that cause localized, temporary disruptive effects on critical infrastructure in the United States. The same threat assessment also spends some time talking about the threats from Russia, North Korea, and others, but it's this threat from China, coupled with the administration's focus on China, that really provided the impetus for this executive order. And a lot of folks, I think, were surprised when the executive order came out on May 1st, but it actually was a policy that had been, as I mentioned, brewing for a while, and there was some external impetus to the decision and to the timing. So there's two reasons I want to talk about briefly. The first one is that some of the government agencies that work on power projects had been considering where they were going to purchase equipment, and there was a fear that they may consider purchasing some of that electronic equipment from Chinese vendors. This got the attention of the White House Office of Trade and Manufacturing Policy and folks at the Department of Energy, who ultimately were the ones who initiated this executive order and helped spearhead it through the policy process. The second factor here is that the time was ripe for this to come to conclusion in the policy process as a result to the increasing tensions with China. And as many of you have observed, our tensions with China right now are reaching new heights. And a lot of this, of course, has to do with the coronavirus and views from the administration that China was not transparent about the origins of that virus and didn't do everything that it could to stop it. But it also has to do with the upcoming elections and the fact that President Trump sees China as being one of the weaknesses of the Biden campaign. And President Biden is seeking to make up for that perceived weakness by attacking the president as being all bark and not much bite. And so as a result of this, both parties right now are rushing to show that they are tougher on China than their rivals. And this empowered hawks in the administration, folks at OTMP and the Department of Energy that were working on these policies, and it finally created the window for them to get this through the process. But just to give you a sense of how this is affecting the entire policy process, if we weren't here talking today about this executive order, we could be talking about the new Huawei rules that came out on Friday. We could be talking about the decision by the Thrift Savings Plan to announce that it would not invest in Chinese companies that came out last week, or even the Uyghur sanctions legislation that was passed last week. So this really, I think, has to be considered in that broader context of what is going on with China. And even if the timing was a little bit of a surprise for folks who follow this industry, this may just be the beginning. And so now what I want to do is turn over to my colleagues to talk more about the details of the executive order itself.
Sure, thank you, Clete. So we have a bit of a visual here to talk us through what is actually covered by the executive order. And so at the outset, I think what's very important to note is that the executive order is a transaction-based control. So it's not a blanket import ban, at least not as it's currently structured. So first we'll start with box 1. So the executive order covers transactions, which is broadly defined, that involve an item that will be used in a U.S. bulk power system. So really the analysis stems on, do I have an item that's connected to the U.S. bulk power system? Now, the EO does provide a definition of the bulk power system. And so that's really the threshold question. If you're not connected to the bulk power system and you answer no to that first box, your analysis really stops. Now, with that, I'd like to turn it over to Chip to walk us through the definition of bulk power system and what it means practically.
Sure. Thanks, Shiva. So the term bulk power system is a term that we use, at least in the energy regulatory space, with some frequency. It's typically thought to basically consist of the U.S. electric grid and generation that is interconnected to that grid. Unfortunately, we don't have much more of a granular definition than that. So the term was originally coined in the Energy Policy Act of 2005, which amended the Federal Power Act to give FERC authority to oversee the reliability of the bulk power system. But FERC, when it was enacting its regulations to implement its new authority over reliability, chose to use another term, the bulk electric system. And the bulk electric system is a fairly well-defined term. It's basically a subsection of the bulk power system. So as a practical matter, unfortunately, the term bulk power system does have some ambiguity, but it's worth taking a look at the components of the bulk power system. So the bulk power system, as defined in the EO, is essentially the same as the definition of bulk power system from the statute. and its facilities and control systems necessary for operating an interconnected electric energy transmission network, and electric energy from generation facilities needed to maintain transmission reliability. A couple of points here. The definition specifically excludes distribution facilities and transmission facilities below 69 kV. I think it's also important to note that the definition does not include generation. It only includes electric energy from generation facilities needed to maintain transmission reliability. And we could talk a little bit more about that later. Shiva?
Thank you, Chip. So going along the decision tree, so you've analyzed your item and you determine that it does in fact connect to the bulk power system as defined in the executive order. So then you go into box 2. Now, Clete mentioned this executive order is really aimed at China. The actual language that is used in the EO is foreign adversaries. And really the administration uses that for political purposes, but we all know that the intent is really China. So when you're looking at your equipment, was it designed, developed, manufactured by a Chinese entity, or does a Chinese entity somehow have another type of interest in the actual item itself? And if the answer to that is no, then you're really outside of the scope practically, although again, one can argue that foreign adversary can be broadly scoped to cover other countries. So assuming we get past box 2, then we get to box 3, which says, does the transaction involve items identified by the U.S. government as used in bulk power systems, substation control rooms, or power generating stations? And they provide a specific list of items there, and you'll see that in the box. So again, you'll have to really look at your item, and you'll have to look at this list and analyze, can my item be captured within these items provided for in the EO? And if the answer to that is no, you go to box 4 and analyze whether your item has broader applications. If your item does have broader applications, then you're in the clear. But if it doesn't, then you're still needing to proceed with the analysis. So let me pause here because I think this list of items down below box 3 is quite important to analyze. So Chip, can you walk us through some of these key items and explain to us your thinking on what the scope of these terms is and how they could apply?
Sure. Well, as a practical matter, these items or components are components you would typically see in conventional generators and high voltage transmission facilities. Renewables, perhaps not so much. I think that the focus here and what has been indicated from us from DOE is really what they are interested in here is looking at whether or not any of these items in a particular facility are susceptible to cyber attacks, either within the item itself or within the BPS, and how critical those items could be to the BPS, to the bulk power system. So, for example, if there was a failure or an attack on one of those items, what would be the cascading effect throughout the BPS? DOE has indicated in some of its conversations thus far that it's not really intended to, even though the statute or even though the executive order is fairly broadly worded and the definition of bulk power system is fairly broadly worded, it will take a very surgical and specific approach to seeing whether or not any of these items could really have a catastrophic effect on the bulk power system. One thing I would like to point out as well is that there is a term in here, large generators, which is a little bit different than the other items here because that is not a term of art. A large generator is not defined somewhere. So a question of whether or not you have generation, whether or not it falls within this list of items, I think is a very big question. I mentioned earlier that there's also a term bulk electric system, which is legally distinct from bulk power system. And bulk electric system is basically the part of the bulk power system to which the NERC reliability standards apply. So even though bulk electric system is not used here, we can use some of the NERC standards that they've been developed, perhaps as a roadmap as to how DOE may interpret some of these terms in its upcoming regulations. So for example, the bulk electric system consists of individual generators of 20 megawatts and above, or aggregated generators of 75 megawatts or above. So once again, while that term is not defined, we can look to NERC standards and to existing regulations for some indication as how DOE may interpret this.
And Chip, this is Dan. Just as a clarification here, we only get to this analysis, if I understand correctly, if the energy generator is in fact interconnecting to the bulk power system that is above 69 kV. If you are talking about a distribution interconnect or a lower voltage interconnect, you don't even get to this discussion. So the people who should be worrying about this are primarily people who are connecting at high voltage.
That is a very good clarification, and that is correct. As I mentioned earlier, the EO specifically excludes the distribution system and transmission facilities below 69 megawatts, and that presumably includes any generation that is interconnected at those levels as well. I mean, once again, even if you are a generator that's interconnected above 69 megawatts, you're not automatically in scope. It really depends on whether or not you're providing reliability service to the grid. Typically, I think most conventional generators, coal, nuclear, natural gas, are considered to be providing reliability benefits to the transmission system. It's an open question as to whether or not you can make the same conclusion with respect to renewables.
Right. It's 69 kilovolts, I think you might correct.
Oh, sorry, yes.
Great. So again, just moving through our flow. So, you looked at your item and you've decided, made a determination that it does, in fact, connect to the U.S. bulk power system according to the definitions we have discussed. And then you do look at your item and say, you know what, it could potentially fall within a large generator or one of these other terms. Then you really go to box 3A. And what's important to say here is, again, going back to what I said at the outset, this is really a transaction-based control. So if your item does meet all of the definitions we've gone through, then it means that the U.S. government, the executive order, gives the agencies the authority to take steps with respect to that transaction, including stopping it. But before doing so, the executive agencies have to make a determination pursuant to the language that I have set forth in box 3A. So again, the relevant agencies here, the Department of Energy and others, have to make a determination that this transaction poses an undue risk of sabotage to or subversion to the design, integrity, manufacturing, production, distribution, installation, operation, or maintenance of the U.S. bulk power system, or an undue risk of catastrophic effects on the security or resiliency of U.S. critical infrastructure or the U.S. economy, or an unacceptable risk to the national security of the United States. Now, interestingly, in just the larger China relations, this term national security has taken on a very different meaning, and the government has viewed it quite expansively. However, in the context of the EO, quite recently, the Department of Energy has given some clarifying comments of what they would consider a transaction that poses the risks at issue and would be subject to a potential prohibition. So, Chip, can I turn it over to you to give us some color on, how the government is viewing, national security risk or sabotage or subversion to the U.S. bulk power system in this context?
Sure, Shiva. Well, those concepts aren't well defined in the executive order. There was one example that DOE gave in one of the sheets that it recently put out to provide some additional clarification as to what the EO was intended to do. The example they gave was a remote attack on some Ukrainian, I believe they were substations, that resulted in about a 6-hour blackout for, I think, about 250,000 people. So that's the example that they've given. And so I think it's fair to say, based on that and other information we've seen, that the concern would be twofold. One, that magnitude of a blackout, of disrupting service to customers, as well as potentially any disruption that would impact nearby U.S. installations, military bases, that sort of thing. So I think, even though we don't have a lot of information to go on right now on the EO, that's probably what the focus is going to be on.
Great. Thank you, Chip.
So thanks, Chip and Shiva, for giving us some perspective and really pulling the executive order apart. I think that is a very helpful process here for people to understand the real focus here, and the risk is for very large projects interconnected to very large or high voltage transmission system. That may cover a significant amount of the market, but my sense is that there's a much larger portion of the market that is probably not going to be subject to the executive order when you view it from the perspective of interconnecting below 69 kV. Let's talk a little bit more then about some of the substantive technology. Chip, can you give us perspectives on some of the technologies that developers may be using to deploy projects to either the high or low voltage grid, and how that fits into the analytical framework you and Shiva just constructed?
Sure. Well, the order doesn't expressly reference different technologies, but I think if you take a closer look at the order, some start to emerge as how different technologies may be treated under the order. But remember, as a threshold matter, that in addition to the transmission facilities at 69 kV and above, the bulk power system includes electric energy from generation resources needed to maintain transmission reliability. And that strongly suggests that really the focus of the order is on conventional resources, natural gas, coal, and nuclear, because those are typically the resources that we think of as providing reliability services to the grid. And batteries also provide reliability components, could also be included at 69 kV or above. I think it's also interesting to note that the administration has, in the past couple of years, really emphasized the need for resources with on-site fuel supplies, mainly nuclear and coal facilities. Those facilities are less likely to be subject to supply disruptions, and they provide a critical resiliency attribute to the grid. It's unclear at this point whether intermittent resources would be, as a general categorical matter, included in the definition of bulk power system. These types of resources are not typically thought of as providing reliability benefits to the grid. I will note two things. One, the order does not expressly carve out renewables, so I believe they are at some extent in scope. And a comment by Peter Navarro recently, he was trying to allay some concerns in the industry that there was a lot of uncertainty about the order, said, and unless you intend to use foreign components that may pose a risk for the bulk power system, including flawed batteries or inferior solar or wind turbine systems, you have nothing to worry about. So that does suggest that the intermittent technologies are also included in scope. But once again, also remember that really what we're talking here is about intermittent resources that are interconnected 69 kV and above. As a practical matter, then, I think that carves out a large chunk of solar, which is interconnecting at lower levels.
So that's very helpful perspective, Chip, on renewables. Can we talk specifically about, for example, solar modules, where a particular brand or type of solar module might be deployed in assets that are both below or above the 69 kV threshold? Does the dual use element of that type of equipment exempt it, or likely exempt it, from the executive order in your view?
I think that there's a strong argument that solar panels and other equipment that really do have applications, legitimate applications outside the bulk power system, would not fall within the definition of bulk power system electric equipment. Once again, I think we get to what we see in the actual regs come out. But there is one point I'd like to make about the definition of bulk power system electric equipment. So there are about 20 components that are identified in the definition. Most of them apply typically to, let's say, transmission facilities or transmission lines and conventional generation facilities. There is, however, one item it's referred to as a large generator. The term large generator is not a term of art. It doesn't really mean anything, and we don't really know exactly what it is and what it encompasses. Can it encompass battery storage? Can it potentially encompass solar modules? I think that's some uncertainty that we're going to have to hopefully try to address in the rulemaking proceedings. It also suggests to me that in addition to generation only being in scope if it interconnects at 69 kV and above, and if it provides a reliability service to the grid, it is possible also what the Department of Energy is considering is that there may also be a size threshold for the generator, say above a certain megawatt nameplate capacity. As an analogy, the NERC standards apply to generating facilities above 20 megawatts or aggregated facilities above 75 megawatts. So it's also possible that coming out of this, in addition to all the other requirements to being in scope, that there may also be a size requirement for the generation resource.
And Chip, just to add to what Chip said, going back to the analytical framework, so again, the definition of bulk power system electric equipment, the way the executive order deals with it, right, is it provides a positive list of equipment, including the large generators that Chip referenced. So the very first threshold question is, what is the scope of these terms and what do they mean? What's also important to stress, which Dan discussed, is any item that's not included in this positive list of equipment and that has broader application of use beyond the bulk power system, those equipment are outside the scope of this order. And that's why these definitions of these positive listed terms are so important. So by way of example, even if your battery is connected to a bulk power system, if depending on how the government defines large generators, batteries might fall outside the scope of the definition of large generators. So then you go to the analytical framework, and your next question is, well, is this battery, it's not on this specific list of equipment, does it have broad application outside of bulk power systems? And if the answer to that is yes, your battery is completely outside the scope of the order, and you don't have to worry about it.
Shiva, agree 100%. Just to add one additional thing, when we are talking about the different technologies and how different technologies could be included within the scope of the order or not, I think it's also important to note that different technologies source their components from different places. So, even assuming that utility scale wind is in scope, a lot of the turbines from those facilities are coming from Europe. They're not coming from China. So even if they are considered part of the bulk power system, and even if they are considered bulk power system equipment, they wouldn't fall within the scope of the order. And similarly, some key general components of the system, SCADA systems, transformers, and switchgears generally are not sourced in China. So even if they are in scope, they wouldn't be impacted because none of the transactions would fall within the requirements of the order.
So given that perspective, Chip and Shiva, the takeaway that I have here is if you're talking about solar batteries, those technologies likely have broader applications than use in the bulk power system, and therefore there should be a high level of comfort, notwithstanding a specific type of technology, solar or battery technology that is tailored for high voltage applications. There should be a significant amount of comfort that solar and battery projects are not going to be affected by the executive order. And similarly, when you talk about other technologies like gas or wind or even SCADA systems and transformers, most of that equipment is coming from friendly nations, Western Europe, the United States. For that type of equipment, for those types of projects, unless you have sourced from China you should take a very, very high level of comfort that your project will be unaffected by the executive order. True or false statements?
So, Dan, as a practical matter, we definitely believe that when the government actually gets to implementing this executive order, what you said will likely be the outcome. And again, I think we take significant comfort in the fact that equipment that's not specifically enumerated in the order, such as large generators that has broad applications, are specifically carved out. So they're not looking to capture everything under the sun. They're really looking to capture the sensitive items. The other thing that gives us comfort, because again, you go through the analytical framework, even if you get to the point of, okay, I am connected to the bulk power system per the definition we discussed, and the item, the Chinese source item, could potentially fall within a large generator, you still have to go to the next step of the analysis of what kind of harm can this equipment inflict. Now, again, the executive order talks about undue risk of catastrophic effects, undue risk of sabotage or subversion, and then they have the catch-all of unacceptable risk to the national security, which, of course, we know right now is broadly defined. So those terms, though, undue risk of sabotage, undue risk of catastrophic effects, really means when we're looking at the equipment that could potentially fall within scope, we have to really analyze what can it do to the bulk power system. And if it's not the type of equipment that can cause these catastrophic effects or risk of sabotage or subversion, then the chances of it being caught are very, very low. So that's on the one hand. So that's what leads us to really agreeing with you, Dan, from a practical perspective. The area that does produce just ambiguity, right, is the fact that, okay, once you get past the bulk power systems definition, and let's say you are connected to it, then again, the definition of bulk power system equipment includes this positive list of items like capacitors, large generators that are so broad. Again, practically speaking, we do believe that your scenario is exactly right, but there is still ambiguity in the executive order.
So it sounds to me, Shiva, based on that commentary, like there's no reason developers should be worrying or changing course on the things that they're doing in the market. No reason investors or lenders should be concerned with this executive order as it pertains to most of the projects in terms of renewables, new generation, certainly connecting below 69 kV.
That is correct. The DOE has mentioned on a number of occasions since the order came out that the industry should not change the way it's currently doing things. I don't think that the impact of the order is intended to be, nor will it be as a practical matter, disruptive to the industry. I think we will see the rules, and the industry will learn how to comply with those rules, just like they do with every other regulation or framework of regulation that comes along, such as NERC. I do think that the process for getting to the final rules is something that the industry should focus on. It's something they should care about. And if you've got a technology or if you've got a particular facility that falls somewhere within the gray area, you're not under 69 kV, maybe you fall potentially within the definition of large generator, then it could potentially be recommended that you spend some time taking a look at the rules and perhaps reaching out to the Department of Energy staff to help formulate what the final answer will be.
Let's get into some of the practical implications beyond the kind of technical ones we've just walked through in terms of pulling the order apart. Shiva, have you seen any other executive action that is analogous to the bulk power system EO?
Yes, Dan, absolutely. So it's quite interesting when you parse it out. So back in May of 2019, the Trump administration issued an executive order on securing the information and communications technology and services supply chain. And I actually did a red line against the two orders, and basically the construct was exactly the same. They just, of course, swapped out the terms and the definitions at issues. And so I think what's important to keep in mind is when the Trump administration issues an executive order, right, that's really just the authority at issue. And what happens next is that the relevant agency has to issue regulations to implement that executive order. And those implementing regulations is really the key and the heart of how the government is going to approach this new law. And if we take a step back, I think it's instructive to just take a step back and analyze what happened with respect to the May 2019 executive order. So in that context, the Department of Commerce was the agency that was in charge of issuing implementing regulations. And as with this executive order at issue, there was a time limit that said that the relevant agency has 120 days to issue implementing regulations. Now, when an agency implements regulations, there's a couple of things it can do, right? So it can issue implementing regulations that are final, right, that become a law effective as of publishing, or they can issue proposed regulations. And in the context of proposed regulations, the industry has an ability to comment. And typically for anything that's significant, it's really supposed to go through proposed regulations and allow the industry a chance to comment. And that's really this concept that was started in the Clinton administration with OMB to give really order and predictability to regulations. So again, in the context of what happened in last May, the Department of Commerce, so again, the executive order was issued May 2019, and the Commerce Department did not issue anything until late November of that year. And they issued proposed regulations, which industry had an ability to comment on. And industry was very, very critical of Department of Commerce's proposed regulations, really because the regulations did not provide further clarity on the scope and what could potentially fall within the prohibitions. So as of today, we still don't have implementing regulations for the supply chain executive order, and we're actually coming on the one-year anniversary of that order. Now, in this case, the Department of Energy has the authority to issue those implementing regulations. So with that, I'll turn it over to my colleague Jamie, who works closely with that agency, to give us a sense of what's practically happening on the ground. Are they moving forward with this? What can we expect in terms of timing on the implementing regs? Will industry have an opportunity to comment?
Okay. While the executive order takes effect on May the 1st, there are certain aspects that will govern the implementation that will take longer to build out. It really proceeds along three different courses. First, there is a 150-day deadline set forth in the executive order by which rules and regulations will need to be put in place to identify the particular country or persons that are considered adversaries for purposes of the order. And it would say that the public comments by department officials to date since the publication of the executive order, they have been very solicitous of feedback, ensuring that they really want to hear from stakeholders and industry. And to that end, they've already conducted 2 stakeholder calls and have a third scheduled for this week. As part of the implementation, they'll need to also identify equipment and countries that warrant particular scrutiny under the order and identify mechanisms that are relevant for mitigation. So all of that has to take place within a 150-day deadline, consistent with Shiva's discussion about the corollary process at the Department of Commerce with the telecom executive order. That's roughly in track. Again, at that 150-day deadline in the commerce context, you don't have a final rule so much as a proposed rule that becomes a basis for public comment. The second track that the executive order lays out, with a little bit more ambiguous timeline defined as soon as is practical, directs the department to identify equipment that is designed, developed, or supplied by foreign adversaries that pose undue risks, and to develop recommendations to identify, isolate, or replace such items as soon as is practical, taking into consideration the overall risk to the bulk power system. All of that effort will be done in coordination with the Department of Defense, the Department of Interior, the Department of Homeland Security, OMB, and the Director of National Intelligence. The executive order also gives the department the authority to include others, and so we might expect other agencies to be involved in this process, including FERC, NIST, and as a standard-setting body, NERC is likely to be involved in this. The third track that takes place deals with the aspect of the federal government's procurement process, and the executive order establishes a task force on procurement-related issues and gives it a one-year deadline to develop recommendations that should be submitted to the Federal Acquisition Regulatory Council that in turn will offer those recommendations for notice and comment rulemaking, again for changes that would be specific to government agency procurement for components of the bulk power system. Looking again at the communications executive order as a corollary, we could expect a proposed rule by September 1st. The communications proposed rule gave a 30-day deadline that was ultimately extended longer, and so folks that are looking at this and beginning to review its impact on their businesses ought to consider whether they should be developing comments along the timeline that's provided under the terms of the executive order.
And Jamie, I'll just add one note, just in our experience on the May 19th supply chain executive order. One of the other considerations is a lot of the companies that we dealt with didn't want to go in and file comments as individuals as to not raise attention. So a lot of industry associations really got involved. So another thing to think about during this time is really, okay, of course, you have to see what those implementing regs are, but what are the concerns that are most important to you? What are the areas of ambiguity that you need answered? And really start thinking through the pros and cons of filing comments individually or working through industry associations to do so.
Two kind of follow-on questions there, Shiva. Number one, given that the executive order seems to apply to only high voltage interconnects, which may be many, if not most, new energy projects being developed. Is it important for industry stakeholders to be involved in this process? And the second question is, what beyond commenting on the rulemaking, are there other avenues for concerned parties to get involved with this and mind their own interests?
So Dan, I'll take the first question, which is a low ball, right? So absolutely essential for companies to be incredibly engaged. So in the context of the May 2019 executive order, for the companies that didn't want to go in directly and put their name in, what we did is worked very closely with the companies to make sure that their concerns were adequately articulated. And in some cases, frankly, we actually drafted the actual text that the industry association ultimately submitted. So you don't want to just leave it right to the industry associations. You want to be really engaged in the process, understand precisely how the ambiguities could impact you, and engage in that process very actively. because the uncertainty creates that. And with respect to your second question, outside of this rulemaking process, is there a way to engage Department of Energy on this proactively? For that question, I'll hand it over to my colleague, Jamie, to address.
Jamie, any thoughts on direct engagement with the Department of Energy on rulemaking and interpretation of the order?
As I noted earlier, the department is taking a very solicitous posture and is seeking feedback, hence the series of conference calls that they've hosted around this executive order. Between now and the publication of a proposed rule, there's obviously opportunity to informally convey ideas or concerns. There's, in fact, a designated email address for questions directed to the department that they've set up. Once that proposed rule goes out, it does move into a more formal process. Obviously, you can provide written comments either directly or through trade associations. Any verbal communications to the department once that notice has been put out is going to be treated as an ex parte communication and would be subject to certain disclosure rules. And so that's how people can think through engaging the department over the next couple of weeks and months. I would also suggest as well that there's a role for Congress to play, and the role that Congress has played in protecting the power sector from cyber threats, really dating back to 2009 when there was a expose on the risks associated in the sector. Fairly incremental steps, I would say, by Congress until 2015, where the FAST Act, which is really a highway bill, but as part of that, there were some cyber provisions that included DOE, its most significant new cyber authorities. Since that time, there have been a number of other bills, and this issue really gets bipartisan support on both sides, the House and the Senate. In this Congress, we've seen the Securing Energy Infrastructure Act pass the Senate with bipartisan support. We have new legislation that Senator Murkowski, the chair of the Energy Committee, has just unveiled in the last couple of days, with a goal of codifying certain agency practices in terms of protecting information they get from industry and state and local governments to foster the collaboration. Looking ahead, recognizing that this is an executive order, I would be mindful that Congress can take additional steps, although they have not, one has indicated that they are yet interested in doing so, but taking this executive order and codifying it, much as the Murkowski bill is trying to do in another context, would be an option. And I would flag for folks, Congress has also taken very drastic and significant steps to amend and expand the CFIUS statute to increase the national security and national economic scrutiny of internationally involved mergers and acquisitions. And so I think, going back to Clete's comments about the factors and the environment that are driving proposals such as this executive order, yes, this executive order in and of itself is significant, but is also must be viewed in the broader context, which Clete helped outline at the beginning of the call.
So would you summarize, Jamie, your strategy here if you were advising a client on how to be involved with this process? Number one, to engage with members of Congress. Number two, to engage with the Department of Energy. And number three, to focus on rulemaking. Or would you think strategically about some other options? Or as Shiva alluded to, I guess, engagement through trade associations. But other strategic things you think might be valuable for stakeholders who want to get involved?
Sure. I think you've outlined the tools that are available to disposal. I think as a precursor, however, is doing the analysis that Shiva and Chip walked us through. Do you have issues that fall squarely within the coverage of the executive order? Are you on the border? Are you outside but concerned that the final rulemaking might sweep you in? So I think that sort of analysis is the first step. I think secondarily, sooner rather than later, trying to engage with the department to flag these concerns. Third, engaging in a parallel path with Congress on those same concerns within a goal. Fourth, being prepared to offer either on an individual basis or through a trade group formal comments to the department as part of the anticipated rulemaking.
Very, very helpful, very thoughtful. Maybe flipping back to you, Chip, can you give us any perspective on the extent to which this executive order will impact existing infrastructure as compared to new construction, new projects?
Sure, and I think Jamie already alluded to this at least. And there is a provision in the EO which essentially says that the Secretary of Energy can look to identify problematic components of the existing bulk power system and can make recommendations with respect to the isolation and potential replacement of those items. Applying the same standard as part of the bulk power system must be one of the components. So remains to be seen how that will play out. DOE has said in some of their guidance that they are not intending to initiate a wholesale replacement of the power grid. But there is this language in there that suggests that even existing infrastructure may not be immune from the reaches of the executive order.
How do you think about this for like retrofits of existing projects? That would fall more into the kind of new build category, or is that something that would be more like an existing piece of infrastructure? And I'm thinking about this from the context, the lens of generators installing battery banks and other resiliency measures that are valued highly, I think, at this point by utilities and grid operators.
I think that I would view those as new transactions now if they are initiated or will be initiated after the issuance of an order. Those are new transactions, new components. So, just because you're not developing a new power facility or putting in a new transmission line, if you have an existing line, you should also be thinking about upgrades or improvements that you may have coming on the horizon and take those also into consideration when thinking about the EO.
Do you perceive, Chip, any ripple effects here into the energy regulatory landscape, or is this going to be fairly constrained to kind of supply chain issues and the like?
I think it still remains to be seen what role FERC and NERC will have in this process. It was interesting when the executive order came out that they were not referenced at all. Subsequently, we've learned, however, that FERC and NERC were very much involved in the process of developing the EO, and they will continue to be very involved in the implementation of the EO. NERC and FERC are the entities that actually have perhaps the most relevant experience with these assets and reliability issues and concerns with respect to these assets. So, I assume that they will have a fairly major role to play, if for no other reason than they spent the last 15 years developing reliability standards, which I think can, to some extent, provide a roadmap going forward. So at the end of the day, it could be very much so that, companies, as part of their regulatory compliance plans, have a FERC compliance plan, have a NERC compliance plan, and potentially also have a bulk power system executive order compliance plan.
So going forward, Chip, how would you advise clients when they're thinking through procurement issues? How would you advise them to manage this concern if they are potentially connecting to the bulk power system or building out the bulk power system?
Right. Well, we've already seen, and going back to something that Shiva said, we've already seen some parties that are about to enter into transactions, and when they fall into the gray areas of not being 100% clear as to whether or not they are in scope or out of scope with respect to the executive order, start thinking through things such as regulatory and change of law termination rights to put into their agreement so as to allocate the risks that at the end of the day, once the regulations come out or once more guidance from the DOE comes out, if any of those facilities are part of the scope, then you have contract provisions to address that.
Would you think of a risk allocation there where the contract could be unwound, or maybe some other features there to protect somebody who's trying to procure really equipment from China, if I understand the kind of arc of this order?
What we've seen so far is people considering transactions that, if at the end of the day their facilities turn out to be in scope, that the transaction could be unwound. One thing I also wanted to point out here is that, based on our reading of the executive order, you could have a contract, say a supply contract that was entered into a couple of years ago, and if you submit a new purchase order after the date of the issuance of the order, then that purchase order would probably be considered a new transaction and be subject to the requirements of the EO.
An excellent point. So Clete, what is your thought on procurement strategies that involve countries other than China?
So clearly China is the main concern here for the U.S. government. And I'm not sure that this policy would have moved forward were it not for the increasing tension with China, and were it not for the administration's views that we need a whole of government approach to counter China's economic aggression and other activities that they take. That said, if you do look at some of the materials being produced by the U.S. government, when they talk about the threat to critical infrastructure, they loop in 3 or 4 adversaries on that same list. And the primary countries that they often talk about are what they call the Big Four, which are China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran. And clearly, those are problem areas. Beyond that, I'm not sure that anyone else is likely to be characterized as an adversary under the executive order, but it's always worth monitoring how this situation evolves, especially as the U.S. does continue to follow a policy of wanting to have more of its materials and supply chains based domestically.
When you look at kind of supply of equipment, particularly sensitive equipment to the United States from that list, it feels to me like the only country of grave concern would be China. There are probably industrialized nations out there that supply, where companies are located, I should say, that supply equipment to the United States, sensitive high-tech equipment to the United States. But those other countries, seems like Russia, North Korea, Iran, not major exporters of equipment into the United States, and certainly not into the United States energy sector, as far as I can see. Well, thank you, panelists, for that informative and enlightening discussion. I personally learned a lot and got a lot of great perspectives and ideas for how I can help people move things forward on the bulk power system order. At this time, we are going to pause and take some questions from the audience. If you don't mind giving us a few moments to collect those questions, we'll be responding to them momentarily. Okay, we are back online. The first questions we have from the audience come from Gordon Alter at S-Power. Gordon had a couple questions I think are good for Clete and Jamie to respond to. First, is the executive order likely to be something a Biden administration would proceed with, or is likely that they would shelve the EO and ultimately rescind it? And secondly, is there any thought in the industry of challenging the executive order due to vagueness as to what foreign adversary means and what the executive order actually covers, since to date there's been no clear guidance from the Energy Department?
Thanks for the question. This is Clete. I'll kick it off, and couple quick thoughts here, and then I'll turn to my colleagues. I mean, first, in terms of the vagueness question and who is the foreign adversaries in question. I mean, this really does start and end with China. As I mentioned, that really was, I think, the impetus for pushing this through. But as I mentioned earlier in the podcast, if you look at some of the reports that we've gotten from the Department of or the Director of National Intelligence, they do also talk about Russia, North Korea, and Iran in a similar context. So I think that the government would be able to point to these as longstanding threats that they've clearly articulated in public documents. and that would be how they responded to that issue. In terms of the Biden administration, toughness on China is one of the few areas where there remains strong bipartisan consensus in Washington. It's an issue that really has been elevated in the context of the election year, with both sides attacking the other one for not being tough enough on China. So I actually think it'd be very difficult for a Biden administration to roll this back without coming under serious attack from the Republican side. I think that regardless of who wins the election, this is the kind of policy that would move forward. And I was also just looking at some of the DNI reports during the Obama years, and they do look at the same threat to critical infrastructure, and they do name China in that context. But again, I think this is a bipartisan thing that would have some bipartisan history.
And yeah, this is Jamie. I would tend to agree. If you look at in Congress, specifically around security of the grid, it's a bipartisan issue. And to the macro political dynamic that Clete describes, I would tend to occur. In terms of challenging the executive order, I would just note that the executive order kicks off a rulemaking process that will formalize the regulations and provide some clarity. And I would point out as well, to the extent that the bulk power system executive order has purposefully mimicked the ICTS executive order, we can look to that proposed rule in that context to see what it had. And I would just, there is a definition contained in the ICTS proposed rule that says a foreign adversary means any foreign government or foreign non-government person determined by the Secretary to have managed in a long-term pattern or serious instances of conduct significantly adverse to the national security of the United States or security and safety of U.S. persons for purposes of the executive order. Still gives the Secretary some fairly broad discretion there, but I would just note again that we're likely to see a definition with a little bit more specificity than what's contained in the executive order as the rulemaking moves forward within that 150-day time period.
Yeah, that's very helpful, guys. And I would also just continue to emphasize and add that this is not intended to be something that disrupts the market in general in terms of renewables or power. And as kind of a follow-on question, Jamie and Clete, was there any sense that this was targeted at clean energy policy as opposed to conventional fuel, conventional power?
From the White House perspective, I haven't heard that kind of rationale given. Rather, it was about China, and that concern is all that I've been aware of.
Yeah, my conversations there and across the administration, similarly, it's the foreign power dynamic, not a particular sectoral politics.
Yeah, and let me add just one more color just to the question of, can industry legally challenge this executive order? The bottom line is, I think from a legal perspective, the chances of a legal challenge being successful is really nil to none. So, taking a step back of what is the legal authority for this executive order, the legal authority goes back to this 1970s statute called the International Emergencies Economic Powers Act. And that's really the statute that all administrations use across the board for sanctions programs. So, for example, think of Venezuela, think of Turkey, etc. And the bottom line is, when you're talking about national security and the president's authority, it's very difficult to challenge that from a legal basis.
Seems like you're talking about a constitutional argument that's going to go quite high up in the legal system in terms of separation of powers, if that's where you're heading.
Right, but bottom line is, again, the authority for it, right, is the International Emergencies Economic Powers Act that Congress passed, in the 70s, and that act is so broad and gives the president really unilateral authority to determine what's a national security threat. So again, in terms of constitutional challenges, the statute is there and the executive order is issued pursuant to authority in the 1970 statute. It'd be very difficult to challenge.
Fair point. And Jamie, do you see any interrelation here with Murkowski-Risch that proposed legislation? Would that possibly trump, for lack of a better word, trump the executive order?
No, the Murkowski-Risch proposal is fairly narrow in scope and really is targeting trying to protect information that the government receives from industry and other stakeholders, so as to foster the collaborative nature of cyber protection issues. But I think you raise a fair point that obviously an executive order, as you've alluded to, or the questioner alluded to, is somewhat subject to administrations, and that it could be rolled back by future administrations or even this administration. So, whether Congress looks at this and sees a need to codify this would be an open question at this point, but something for folks to keep an eye on.
Great. Let's move on to a couple related questions here, a cluster of questions, one from Michael Wong, one from Kevin Christie, and one from Eric Wessoff. First of all, and I think this is really a good question for you, Chip and Shiva, to respond to. If a renewable generator is providing ancillary services or capacity in addition to energy, will that trigger the reliability benefits test? Secondly, do solar projects under LGIAs, which often require low voltage ride-through and reactive support, potentially pull solar inverters into reliability benefits definition? And then lastly, in PJM using Chinese solar modules and inverters for frequency regulation, could these be considered reliability for the bulk power grid concept?
Sure, I can go ahead and get started. Want to reemphasize something I think that Shiva said at the beginning of our conference today, and that's that this is looked at on a transaction by transaction basis. It's looked on as a facility by facility basis. So I don't expect the final guidance that we get will say something along the lines of, if you are providing reactive service, then we deem you to be critical, and so you are within scope. My view of it is that if you've got a solar facility, renewable facility that's providing reactive power pursuant to an LGIA, that the failure to provide that service is extremely unlikely to have the catastrophic effect on the grid that the EO was intended to address. So I think I would be very surprised if at the end of the day, because you're providing reactive power, that somehow you would be deemed to be critical and therefore within scope. And similarly, with respect to capacity, I don't see that. You can think about reliability in a couple different ways. You can think about grid reliability in terms of operations. You can also think about grid reliability in terms of resource adequacy. But from my view, if you are a project selling capacity in the PJM market, or you're bilaterally selling, resource adequacy, products out in California, once again, that's going to be very unlikely for your failure to kind of live up to those obligations to provide the, catastrophic effects on the system that are envisioned by the EO. In particular, and the question was specifically with respect to renewables. If you're a renewable facility, you're intermittent anyway, so your capacity that you're selling is a kind of a fraction of what your nameplate capacity is in any event. So I would be very surprised at the end of the day if a renewable facility were deemed to be within scope because of either providing capacity or reactive power.
Now, Chip, that conclusion might change if you have a battery firming the intermittency, which it seems to be a trend in the industry these days.
Yeah, I think that's a fair comment. Once again, getting back to the facility by facility basis, it looks to me that what is intended here is that they're looking at the facility. They're probably looking at the topography of the grid around the facility and what could actually happen if a generator, if a battery storage unit went offline. What is actually the impact on the system?
And the last point on kind of Chinese modules and inverters and frequency reg.
I think pretty much the same. I would be surprised if they were considered in scope because of providing those services. I go back to the facility by facility basis. studies are done, interconnection studies, so you have something of an understanding of the impact of a particular facility on the grid. I think it probably behooves owners of resources that may or may not be within scope that are in the gray area to kind of take a look at their facilities and try to start charting out what could be the impact on the grid if we went offline.
Anything to add to that, Shiva?
Nothing to add. I think Chip covered it really well. Thanks, Dan.
Okay. Then the last question we have on our webinar is the question about timing. Since it is a transaction-based control, are contracts signed prior to the executive order excluded? I believe, Chip, you alluded to some notes around whether you've signed a purchase order after May 1st in regards of a contract executed prior to May 1st being potentially an area of concern.
That's right. The language in the EO on this point, like many other points, is somewhat ambiguous. I think the term that is used is, if you've initiated a transaction prior to May 1st, then you should be okay. So I kind of take that to mean if you've executed a purchase order for delivery in 6 months or a year and you executed prior to May 1st, then that transaction is potentially not in scope. But if you've signed kind of a master supply agreement and submit a purchase order prior to May 1st and then submit a purchase order after May 1st, then I think that could potentially be in scope. Once again, you got to go through the whole analysis of bulk power system electric equipment above 69 kV. But just overall, I think that type of transaction would not be excluded.
Yeah, and just to add on to what Chip says, again, just going back to the point that the EO is a transaction by transaction basis, and the EO views a quote transaction as quite broad and uses the term any acquisition, importation, transfer, or installation. So you can definitely envision a scenario where a particular contract is signed before May 1st, but the acquisition, importation, transfer, installation, etc. happens after that. And under the plain language, those activities that happen after, regardless of the contract signing, would be covered. And that's also consistent with how the executive order issued for supply chain security in May of last year was interpreted as well.
Excellent. Any other comments from the panel before we wrap it up? Okay, well, look, thank you, panel. This was an incredibly informative and helpful session. I think we all learned a lot. I'll remind the audience that we are here as a resource for you. If you have further questions, concerns, we are here to help in any way that we can. But thank you for joining us this morning and this afternoon, wherever you are, and we look forward to speaking with you all soon. Take care.